it is actually not optimal for the patient or the provider to do one-on-one because, as you know, you don't know when you need a capsular tension ring. You just hope that it's sitting up on the shelf when you need it.
Welcome to Season 6 of EyeCan, a podcast about ophthalmology through a uniquely Canadian lens. EyeCan is co-hosted by me, Patty Sahed, and Heather O'Donnell. Throughout the season, we'll have guest co-hosts for some of our shows. We will share our experiences as ophthalmologists today and tackle some of the challenges we face as healthcare providers. Season 6 of EyeCan is brought to you by Astellas Pharma Canada and Johnson & Johnson Vision. We thank them for their support. Welcome to a new episode of EyeCan. Today, we explore an important issue that affects all ophthalmologists in Canada, drug shortages, with Dr. David Plemel, the COS Liaison for Drug and Device Shortages. Dr. David Plemel is an orbit and oculofacial plastic surgeon based in London, Ontario. He is an assistant professor in the Department of Ophthalmology at the Schulich School of Medicine and Dentistry at Western University and practices at the Ivy Eye Institute at St. Joseph's Healthcare, London. Dr. Plemel earned his MD from the University of Saskatchewan, residency from the University of Alberta, and fellowship from the University of Calgary. Dr. Plemel serves as the secretary of the COS Board of Directors, in addition to his work on the drug shortages portfolio. David, we're excited to have you on EyeCan, so welcome. And let's jump right into to this topic. Drug shortages, for as long as I can remember, over the last 2 decades, have always been kind of a frustrating reality of practicing ophthalmology. However, I do notice that I'm hearing more about it through the COS in kind of a proactive way, getting updates on a regular basis with regards to drug shortages and what's being done about it. And that feels different than maybe when I first started practicing 15 years ago. So can you tell us more about when COS got more involved in drug shortages and why?
The COS has always been an informal advocate in this realm. And it was Dr. Jamie Taylor, who you might know from glaucoma as well. He really revolutionized this role back in 2018.
And what was the goal of formalizing that? What was the purpose there?
Yeah, it was back in 2018. It was when home atropine and atropine were about to be lost from the Canadian market. The COS really reflected on this and said, does becoming involved with this fit the mandate of our organization? And if you look at the mission statement of the COS, it really does fit within this. We are trying to be the advocate for vision care for all Canadians, trying to help people optimize medical and surgical care, promote excellence. And so, yes, in 2018, the COS reflected on it, said who would be a good leader from this regard, and Jamie Taylor stepped up. COS went from being more of a passive player to being an active player, trying to get ahead of and discuss, be part of the drug shortages.
Yes, I do remember in my early days of the COS board hearing from Jamie about this, and even in the glaucoma circle, he would often talk to us about his role in the drug shortages. So I see that early passion in his has persisted even beyond his term. So thanks for leading that after Jamie. And so, what's your understanding of how the COS's role has evolved over time since those early days with Jamie Taylor?
We no longer have a glaucoma specialist doing it, which I always laugh. It is something that I've had to pick up where Jamie left off, and he was awesome at doing it. And there was a great success with that original work in 2018. Atropine was kept in the Canadian market, but shortly thereafter, Timolol went into shortage. Then we had a verteporfin shortage, and then COVID-19 hit. And I don't know if you remember this time, but I think a lot of people probably will reflect on this time where all of our potent ophthalmic steroids went into shortage. In early 2023, when Health Canada has a list of all the tier 3 shortages, the ophthalmic drops were 3 out of 27 of the tier 3 drug shortages in all of Canada. So imagine that our drops were 10% of the list of tier 3 shortages. And so over time, I think the way that this role has been evolving is that we've gone from being more reactive to more proactive. And in the summer of 2023, kind of on the tail end of that drug shortage, that potent ophthalmic steroid drug shortage, we made the first ever Ophthalmic Essential Medication List for Canadians, and it was published then by the COS.
I'm not sure what a tier three shortage means, but I will ask you more about that a little later. But before we get to that, this idea of the essential medication list sounds interesting. Has it made a difference? Just wearing our evidence based hat is as your experience been that publishing this ophthalmic essential medication list made a difference in terms of the frequency or severity of drug shortages in ophthalmology?
I was optimistic it would. It has not, sadly, no. That year was really busy for drug shortages. And right around that time, we had the potent ophthalmic steroids go into shortage. We had intraoperative miotics go into shortage. We had several glaucoma drops go into shortage. We had some dilating drops, including cyclopentolate and atropine, go back into shortage. Topical anesthetics went into shortage. And then even at one point, we had the BSS solution for the cataract machine go into shortage. So in short, it didn't make a difference. But I think we'll probably talk about it later. I think it will hopefully set the foundation for future shortages and put us in a better position.
Okay. And how about today, February 2026? What do you feel are the drugs or the products that are either missing or most at risk of missing soon? And what do you suggest to your colleague clinicians and the public to stay kind of in the loop about shortages?
I hope that this podcast stays timeless in the sense that there's thankfully on the COS website a drug shortage page. And that drug shortage page is linked back to Health Canada's pages, and it updates every 24 hours. So members can check the COS webpage and find what is up to date at all times within the ophthalmic realm. Right now, we do have an exciting time happening. Health Canada is also changing itself. So the web page has changed from just being drug shortages to now being drug and device shortages. And from an ophthalmic standpoint, we have verteporfins back in shortage, capsular tension rings are in shortage, and now in evolution, there is maybe a shortage of fluoroquinolones happening. But we've had successes. And even within the verteporfin shortage, we really reacted to it quickly. We were able to get out some guidelines by working with the Canadian Retina Society. With the capsular tension rings, there has now been authorization of exceptional importation status. So there are now capsular tension rings back in. And even though the fluoroquinolone possible shortage has not been reported yet, in the next week, we will probably send out from the COS as part of our monthly newsletter a little bit more information to our members so that they're aware, even though it's still in evolution, they'll be ahead of the curve.
So I'm just trying to imagine prior to the COS playing such a proactive role, you suddenly just take the example of capsular tension rings, suddenly are not able, a hospital is not able to order capsular tension rings, and then each individual hospital is trying to advocate to look for alternative solutions. Whereas now you have the COS kind of playing a role, trying to find solutions, and then, coming back to all the individual hospitals with some kind of a recommendation. So what was happening before? What was happening before the COS? If you had a shortage of something like a capsular tension ring, was it each individual hospital advocating on their own, or was there another avenue to do this with a more concerted effort?
There continue to be other avenues that happen, and every month there are territorial and provincial representatives who sit down with Health Canada saying, this is what we're experiencing in our zone right now. Something small like a capsular tension ring seems very big to ophthalmology, but it might not hit the radar very easily. And so at a very practical level, a surgeon, knowing that they had a patient or patients within their practice who might need capsular tension rings, would therefore otherwise be going through Health Canada's special access program and trying to match one device to one patient, which is very different than the exceptional importation status, where all of these devices are brought in so that they can be distributed to all of the surgical centers. That's different, like I said, than the special access program, which is meant to match one device or one drug to one patient.
Yeah, and of course, the CTRs is a perfect example of these are things that you often don't know in advance, right? And having gone through the special access process, it's a time-consuming process, and so expecting each individual surgeon to have to do that in preparation for potential need sounds like a big barrier to offer that level of care, as opposed to doing what COS is helping us to do now. So that's great to see that.
And Hedy, there's something that's even interesting about it because it's onerous not only on the clinician, it's difficult for the patient, it's also difficult for Health Canada. Because when it comes to device shortages, for example, and this surprised me, we had to sit down, I got to sit down with the medical device shortages unit and the drug shortages unit not so long ago. The number of Health Canada employees who are working on all the device shortages for every part of medicine at all times in all of Canada is 3 people.
Hmm.
So if we were all in shortage of something and we all had to put in that paperwork, and they're trying to turn all of this paperwork around and get that device out to you or at least get the paperwork back to you so you can import it. And they want to turn that around in 72 hours. It's very difficult for 3 individuals and that whole system built on that. So it is actually really important, in my opinion, that we have these conversations ongoing such that they know that at a clinical level, it is actually not optimal for the patient or the provider to do one-on-one because, as you don't know when you need a capsular tension ring. You just hope that it's sitting up on the shelf when you need it.
EyeCan wants to know what you think. Please send your comments on today's episode or any suggestions you may have for topics or features to communications@cos-sco.ca, and we'll try to incorporate them into future episodes.
EyeCan veut savoir ce que vous en pensez. Veuillez envoyer vos commentaires sur le balado d'aujourd'hui ou vos recommandations de sujets à communication@cos-sco.ca et nous essaierons de les intégrer dans les prochains épisodes.
My name's Hussein Hollins, and I listen to the EyeCan podcast.
Pivoting to just what causes these shortages, frankly, to myself, and I imagine a lot of clinicians, just seems like a big black box. Why do certain drugs go into shortages versus others? And so can you help us understand what in general at a high level causes drug shortages?
The 10,000-foot view is that there's supply, demand, and regulation. And those 3 interplay to potentially create problems. So supply and demand are an obvious one. If we use an example where there's one medication made by one company, if said medication became difficult or unavailable for that company to make, then there would be a drug shortage because the demand would outpace the supply. And if you change that example to say there's one medication made by 2 companies, each company made 50% of the supply of that, then if one company was unable to produce it, the other company would only have 50% of the supply available. So there would be, again, a drug shortage because there would be a demand that outpaces the supply. And hopefully that second company can pick up their production and make up for that demand over time. But regulation jumps into that finally by saying what is sold in the first place. And that's why in that example number 1 or 2, there isn't just a third company that is able to say, we can offer this medication to the environment, because they have to go through all of the processing and the regulations to become a product that is allowed to be sold in Canada. And even under tight timelines, when Health Canada really wants to get it done, that's somewhere between 12 to 18 months, even if that's on a fast track.
Okay. There's something you mentioned earlier that I was hoping to double click on. And you had mentioned that 10% of tier 3 shortages were ophthalmic drugs at some point. And so can you, first of all, tell us what a tier 3 shortage is as opposed to other tier shortages? And then also explain why ophthalmic drugs seem to be particularly prone to shortages compared to non-ophthalmic medications.
There are 3 tiers. Tier 3 is the top tier. So tier 1 is when there's an anticipated shortage with minimal impact. At this point, Health Canada is usually talking to the company. The company has said, we anticipate there being a problem, and nothing much is done about it, but both are aware that something could come of it. Tier 2 is when there's an actual shortage, but at a tier 2 level, either it's not highly significant, and that might be because it is not a critical medicine or that there are therapeutic alternatives to it. So Health Canada at this point might look for alternatives. They might talk about authorizing some foreign importation or expediting licensing like we talked about before. But it's only once we hit tier 3 that we consider that a critical shortage. And it makes it more public. It advertises for foreign access supply. And interestingly, there are actually some small companies in Canada who look out for that tier 3 shortage list. And those companies specialize in then finding a foreign supply that then they remarket into the Canadian market. So there is a whole market that exists around tier 3 shortages. I think the next part of your question was why ophthalmology? There are a number of reasons. One is that ophthalmic medicines are sterile for the most part. And this is unlike oral medications, but this means that most ophthalmic medications have to be made in facilities that have clean rooms with laminar airflow to finish the process. And there's only a certain number of these facilities that can be built because the cost of building one of those facilities is high. So high complexity sterile manufacturing. Equipment fragility, you can imagine that if there's a mechanical failure at a single machine, especially if there is a small supply of a medication, like verteporfin is a great example. It's made by one company in one place. That difficulty with them manufacturing equipment fragility has led to a global multi-year shortage. Of course, there's capacity displacement. I'm from Saskatchewan, so I'm going to use a farming example to explain this one. So farmers have a limited amount of farm in which to plant their crops and make a living. And we have certain environmental considerations in Saskatchewan, so we can only plant cool weather crops, for example. And a farmer might say, I'm going to plant a hardy crop like barley. It's overall weather resistant, weed resistant, pretty reasonable choice. But could you make more money from that limited land? So at a potentially higher upfront cost, a lower environmental tolerance, you've got canola. It's a higher cost, higher risk, but would provide higher economic reward if all goes well. And in drug manufacturing, it's very much the same. Drug companies have a limited amount of square footage in their production facilities. So if a company wants to make a profit, they're going to have to think about the same thing the farmer does. If you have an increased demand for a more lucrative medication, and either it's more lucrative because it's higher market or higher volume, then the medications that company produces might shift over time. So think GLP-1 weight loss drugs. They're hugely profitable right now. Through capacity displacement, there might be a little less manufacturing room left on the table for other less economically profitable drugs because they just get pushed off the line. We also have specialized packaging in ophthalmology that we don't see in other places. And then there's market consolidation. There are not that many manufacturers making the medications that we make. And within that is also generic attrition, that if the profit margins fall, a company may consider dropping the production of that because there simply isn't an economic case. And that leads, again, to further consolidation.
How about Canada as a country? How do we compare in terms of risk or frequency of drug shortages to other countries and why?
Canada is a huge country, but a relatively small population. So we're actually about 2% of the global market. And even though there are countries with smaller populations than us, say many European countries, they are part of a market bloc, which is the EU. The USA is right beside us, and they're 10 times us. So companies will often prioritize bringing things into a larger market, and there are usually more players within those larger markets, which again, less consolidation because there is a bigger population to service. In Canada, again, we have a lot of consolidation. We also have a just-in-time model. There's not a lot of stockpiling of medications within Canada. So in the case of a pandemic, we don't have any backup. And then we have some unique regulatory barriers. Think language, for example. Packaging must be bilingual. So in the case of a shortage, it's difficult to divert stock from one company or from a company that was meant to go into another country and divert it into Canada because they might not meet all of our requirements.
And so if we just imagine being in clinic and getting that frustrating fax from the pharmacy saying, sorry, the drug you prescribed is on back order, is not available. what should a clinician do to make sure that it's already listed, and how do they know if it's listed, and what should they do if it's not listed?
The Health Canada website is great. It's a ton of information on their website. So the COS has that great ability to pull the ophthalmic information. So to go number one is maybe link or create a bookmark on your internet browser to the COS drug shortage website. I think it's actually a great step for everybody to take because it has all that information there. And if there is something, though, that is not found on there, it's a good idea to let COS know about it. And there are reporting ways to do it through Health Canada as well. But through COS, when we start to hear about it, we do kind of act like the boots on the ground sometimes, where we will then bring that forward to Health Canada or the companies that are involved with the production. And we have fairly good relationships on both sides to bring that forward and discuss it.
And so if something's not there, what is the likelihood that it doesn't get reported organically, and how important is it for somebody to actually do something about it as opposed to wait for, Health Canada to find out on their own?
That's a good question. And so it is Health Canada requires companies legally to report. So it is mandatory reporting, but there are not penalties for not reporting. There technically could be penalties, but it is not common within the Canadian system that companies are penalized for not reporting. So it is actually quite important because something could just not be reported. What makes us unique as well, though, is that Canada is a big country. And even though medications will get dropped into the country all at the same time, they often get dropped into one warehouse at one address in one place and then have to be shipped from there. So it is possible that the medication is not truly in shortage, but there are localized shortages across the countries in places where it takes longer for the medication to reach. And that, I think, is what makes Health Canada so important. And the meetings that they have with their provincial and territorial counterparts on a monthly basis, so that kind of acts like a canary in the coal mine. If something hasn't been reported, is there actually some fragility in the system that's being recognized at a local level, indicating that some levers need to be pulled?
Can you tell us more about the relationship between COS, Health Canada, and the industry partners that make or distribute these medications that go into shortage? What is that relationship like, and how does it play out when there are shortages?
Yeah, it's an ever-evolving relationship, and I think that over time we've developed better relationships with both our industry partners and with Health Canada itself. And I think that over time we've become, and I've used the word boots on the ground, to say that there are a lot of members who just are going to recognize those shortages and put that back towards the centralization of the COS. And COS is also looking at listserv discussions. For example, we have communications like Sightlines or eBlasts, but being a steady partner in communication, providing information to Health Canada has gone both ways. So there are lots of times over the last couple of years where we have been contacted to try to give an impression of what it means for a medication to be in shortage. And it's because the individuals at the drug shortage unit are excellent, but don't always know what it means to have a drug shortage, how that would impact a patient, and what a long-term shortage would result in. And I think that capsular tension rings we discussed already were a great example. The question really became, well, what's the alternative? And why wouldn't you know in advance that there might be a problem in advance of the surgery? And so to be able to give that input is quite helpful. We also get a seat at the tier assignment committees when those come up. So we get to have a voice amongst the other territorial partners. The Canadian Medical Association will often have a seat at that. There'll be Health Canada representatives. So we provide our input within that to elevate these to a tier 3 shortage. We've also been able to create some guidelines. Verteporfin was a good example where we worked with the Canadian Retina Society and put that together, and we're able to pass that back to Health Canada so that they could see how on a local level we're also working to have it happen. And the essential medication list that we created in 2023, it's become a more proactive way of discussing it. So when a shortage is reported, we'll often just jump back to that essential medication list, look at some of the therapeutic alternatives, and have a starting point so that we can turn around the clinical impact section much quicker for Health Canada, which in the end will result in a quicker turnaround, hopefully, to get a medication back on the market.
And how do you feel Health Canada is trying to prevent these drug shortages from continuing? Is there some strategic approach to lowering the risk of the shortages, and is Health Canada able to be proactive about drug shortages?
Health Canada is really trying, and they have been evolving as a mandate. And I think we talked about how the medical device shortage unit, MDSU, is it's a smaller unit than the drug shortage unit, and it's also a newer unit. It actually came about really in COVID-19. They used to be an ad hoc group that came together, and during COVID-19, there were so many device shortage issues that they coalesced this into its own unit. And from the medical device shortage unit standpoint, they are trying to evolve or grow to become something much more like the medical device shortage unit. What's interesting is that those are completely independent entities within Health Canada, despite having some similarities that they could learn from each other. And so Health Canada came out with a plan that they called Building Resilience. And within that, they have tried to publish a list of drugs that were critical and vulnerable to shortage, so kind of like an essential medication list. They've tried to require shortage management plans to have some safety stock. They've tried to enhance some of the regulatory responses, improve the reporting systems. And when it comes to the reporting systems, when it came to medical devices, it meant that they actually changed their whole web page to now also reflect medical device shortages and not just drug shortages. And from that, they actually changed the whole title of it. They've changed their website, and it's medical health product shortage website rather than drug shortage overall.
And so as we wrap up, what do you think are the misconceptions that our colleague ophthalmologists have about health product shortages that you would love to kind of debunk?
I think it's the misconceptions that I myself had walking into this. And I've realized that such small things can have a big effect. And it's that whole butterfly effect in chaos theory, where a small change somewhere in a big complex system can have big effects once it hits the end of the line. So I'll give you an example. And this is a true example from a recent shortage that we had here in Canada. The plastic wrap that I talked about is one of the reasons that the ophthalmic devices are so likely to run into shortage, that we have specialized plastic wrap to keep everything sterile. So that plastic wrap is meant to go around the product. In one of the shortages, it wasn't delivered in time to the manufacturing facility. The production lines at that facility only produce the Canadian version of that product 1 day per month. So therefore, no product was wrapped and none was available to ship to Canada. The next day, that product line is producing the same medication, but for other countries. So why could we not use the non-Canadian version? It's because one of the ingredients in the Canadian version was different from the one used elsewhere. And that's because that particular ingredient came from a different supplier. And they didn't bother changing the Canadian supplier because it would cost enough money, the upfront cost of changing the supplier and going through the barriers to accredit or attain the same regulation would be so large. So they just kept with a slightly more expensive supplier than what they switched to a cheaper supplier in other places. And so even though we used the same formulation, it was the one ingredient that was different. Our version, but not the other, was Health Canada approved. And so that single ingredient being supplied from a different manufacturer didn't make a difference until there was no plastic wrap on that given day. Those events collapsed the Canadian supply of that medical product overnight. And when Health Canada came and said, what's the significance? Without giving any details, I can say it would have been a catastrophe. And I think that every single ophthalmologist would have experienced that shortage to a massive detriment of us. And Health Canada took that information. They brought together a tier assignment committee. They gave exceptional importation status to an alternative product. And there was no impact to anybody. So a small change can make a big difference. And the other one, and we talked about this already, was the special access program, because I always thought of the special access program as a way to obtain drugs or devices in the event of a shortage, but it's truly meant for drugs or devices that are otherwise not available, even under alternative circumstances. So a good example in Canada is that cyclomydrol, used for pediatric or ROP dilation. It's not Health Canada approved. However, it can be accessed through the special access program, whereas capsular tension rings that we've talked about are Health Canada approved, and they are usually available. And so normally we should be able to get CTRs. In Health Canada, when we were discussing the CTR shortage, they asked me, they said, one of our number one requests for all the devices we have in Canada is that people will request a certain type of a capsular tension ring. And you have one available in Canada, don't you? But there's a different one that everybody seems to ask for. And why is that? And so it was kind of a quandary for Health Canada, because to them, the special access program shouldn't necessarily be needed in those cases because we had something that was a therapeutic alternative to them.
I'd love to unpack a scenario where a drug is discontinued because a pharmaceutical company has decided that it no longer made financial sense to maintain that product in the Canadian market. And what leverage does the COS or Health Canada have to try and convince a company that's already made a financial decision? I know this has happened for several products over recent years. And so can you share how it is that COS and Health Canada can even approach a decision that seems to already have been made?
That is an awesome question and a very difficult one to answer. Each time is so different. I think one of the most important ingredients coming into these shortages or potential discontinuations is having money in the bank. And by that, I mean being already a trusted and reliable partner to the industry partners and to Health Canada, so that when something like this has happened, atropine was a great example of that, and home atropine back in 2018, that COS was able to come to the table to discuss it in a very level table discussion with industry partners and Health Canada, indicating the impact and trying to understand from an economic standpoint why that decision would be made. Whereas the companies, which are made up by people, ultimately, yes, shareholders for a lot of them, but those shareholders are also patients, and how that might impact it. But without having, I say money in the bank, I mean an existing relationship that you can already draw some dividends from, those discussions aren't likely to go anywhere. And so what I have found incredibly important over time is to ensure that we remain approachable. And I'll give you an example that in the last 7 days, I've had 3 drug companies reach out about shortages that have not hit the big times, and reach out just to discuss it and talk about what the impact would be, how could they work around it. And the same thing came out of a couple that almost got close to discontinuation. And through discussions, they said, you know what, we're not going to actually discontinue it. We'll keep it on. And it was just kind of fireside chats.
Love it. Kindness and collaboration does the trick. That's interesting that that's your experience about what makes a difference in a lot of these situations. Amazing. So we're going to move to our lightning round, where we do a quick series of snappers that will allow our listeners to just learn a little bit more about you as our guest today. So I'll just start with a question about your favorite holiday. Would it be a ski trip or a beach trip?
That's a great question. I love going out to the mountains, and I grew up in Saskatchewan, but representing Saskatchewan, you'll see a good number of Olympians are still doing winter sports. And when I grew up, that was our one big family holiday, was that we would go 1 week every year out to the mountains, and we'd stay in a 1-bedroom condo, all 5 of us. And we would just ski and hang out. So I love going out and skiing in the mountains. And snowboarding is my usual. I say skiing, but it's snowboarding.
Awesome. I know you're a teacher at Western. So as a teacher, are you Tough love or holding hand?
I think we'd have to ask the residents.
What's
I've
your
been,
guess?
my guess is that I am an intimidating but caring teacher. And I've been told by a number of the residents that there's nobody who makes them more nervous than me, but not for a bad thing. And not, I don't think it's for a bad reason. I don't think. And one of the things that we've done, Hetty, that's really fun lately is that we've been hosting an ophthalmic Olympics. I've been hosting an ophthalmic Olympics where we go to the cadaver lab and we have 2 days preparing for it. But on the third day, they are split into teams and they compete in a series of tasks that I grade as they do it. And then I also give them quizzes, which I think are slightly difficult. I think 3 of the questions on the last one were Canadian ophthalmic history, and it was who invented the tarsoconjunctival flap that goes from the upper lid to the lower lid. It's Wendell Hughes. He's from Ontario. It was who invented the curvilinear capsulorhexis, Howard Gimbel. And I can't remember the last one, but it's just something fun where we go to the cadaver lab, we compete against each other, and I have high expectations for them, but the payoff is big.
It sounds like tough love with a loving hand. So that's great. On that topic, has becoming a parent changed the way you teach?
That's a good question. Has it changed the way I teach? I think that becoming a parent has, like most people, made me think about what is value. And I love my job. I really value what I do. I love my wife, who happens to be Dr. Maya Tong, a cornea specialist, and she is awesome at what she does. And I love my children. And I suppose over time, what it makes me constantly try to reevaluate is how much value can I place in any one of these buckets, knowing that I have a limited amount of time? And how can I ensure that the time that I spend doing any of these things, be it teaching, clinical work, COS, being with my children, how can I ensure that the payout from that is high for, in the example of the learners? So I would say that my teaching is probably over time becoming more concentrated for the time that I have with the residents, being that I know that the competing interest is my 2 daughters and my wife.
Yeah, makes sense. I have to say, it's changed my, I've been a parent now for 8 years, and it's changed my approach. I think, prior to that, ophthalmology learners are just so high achieving and often type A. It's just so great. We're so blessed with really bright learners, and I think I just saw them as that. These like bright, high achieving colleagues. And I think becoming a parent, not right away, but I think over time, just somehow imagine one of my kids being a resident one day and realizing that they can be high achieving and really, really bright, but they're still growing adults, that have their humans, that have their imperfections and areas for development. And so I think I softened up a little bit and had a little bit more empathy, and I hope that it's not at the cost of still expecting them to reach their full potential. And I don't think it has. I still have high expectations, but it's just softened it a little bit and reminded me that all these amazing colleagues are human beings, of course.
I think you're right. I would say you used the word empathy, and I think I do have more empathy towards all of my colleagues and probably all of my patients as well, because I recognize that some days I come to work and I am exhausted, but I still put on my smile and I do my work. And I recognize that some people, residents, patients, or the patient's loved ones, are going through something difficult that might last longer than just having a baby. And it might go on for years and years and years. And so I think that it certainly makes you reflect on, what do you value? Do I value somebody who has every single answer, or do I value the resident who is going to be curious about the patient and might not have the answer at their fingertips, but is curious enough about the patient to want to find the answer.
Yeah. Yeah. My last snapper for you is when it comes to fitness, are you a data tracker or see how my body feels?
I have never tracked any data in my life when it comes to my own fitness. And
Okay.
I don't wear a smart anything. In fact, I'm not a social media individual, and I walk to work every day. It's about a 20-ish minute walk. And there's good literature to say that we are made happier by recognizing that we're in nature. And so I try, as I walk to work, I try to recognize that I am in nature, even though I'm in the city, to try to improve my overall resilience through the day. And that said, I mean, I've been lifting weights since I was, I think, 13 years old. And that's when I went into high school, and they told me if I just lift weights, then I'd be big enough to be a linebacker. And it did not work.
Yeah. Great. Well, David, thanks for sharing that last bit and the rest of the conversation, of course, about drug shortages. I think it's for the average clinician, it's just seen as a frustration, right? That you're not able to give your patient that medication or product, but it's been so useful to hear, what goes on behind the scenes, how we can help, and everything the COS is doing to help us and our patients get the medications and devices they need. So thank you for everything you're doing at the level of COS and for the time you spent today helping our listeners understand this topic better. Thank you.
It's a pleasure, Hedy, and I'm glad that we talked about it. And I think that what was so meaningful and is so meaningful about this role or other roles that we take that are beyond just the clinical encounter is that sometimes we can play a role that can impact more patients than we would ever be able to see in a given day. And I hope that what people recognize by whether it be the drug shortages or many of the other roles that the COS does, it's that it's trying to give good health outcomes to more than just the patient who you can see in the room. We are really trying, I think, to try to help every Canadian.
I love that, David. I did a Master's of Public Health at Hopkins in Baltimore, and the public health school was on one side of the street and the medical school was on the other. And you walked into the medical school and it said, as you enter, saving lives one at a time. And then you'd cross the street and go to the public health school and it said, saving lives 1 million at a time. And I think, in your case, it's saving eyes, one at a time in clinic versus millions of eyes at a time or some variation of that number. But the concept is absolutely, we can, the work you're doing is amazing. You're stepping out of your clinical role where you're making a huge difference to one patient at a time and making this difference on a broader scale, and absolutely encourage anybody wanting to do that to take on roles like yours to make that difference. So thanks again for doing that.
A pleasure.
Thank you for joining us for this episode. We look forward to bringing you more engaging content over the coming months.
Merci de vous être joint à nous pour cet épisode. Nous avons hâte de vous proposer d'autres contenus captivants au cours des prochains mois.
EyeCan wants to know what you think. Please send your comments on today's episode or any suggestions you may have for topics or features to communications@cos-sco.ca, and we'll try to incorporate them into future episodes.
EyeCan veut savoir ce que vous en pensez. Veuillez envoyer vos commentaires sur le balado d'aujourd'hui ou vos recommandations de sujets à communication@cos-sco.ca et nous essaierons de les intégrer dans les prochains épisodes.
Thank you from the Canadian Ophthalmological Society.
Merci de la part de la Société canadienne d'ophtalmologie. Our sponsors for Season 6 of EyeCan are Astellas Pharma Canada and Johnson & Johnson Vision. We thank them for their support.
EyeCan is available wherever you listen to your podcasts and, of course, through the COS Practice Resource Center.
EyeCan est disponible partout où vous écoutez vos balados et bien sûr au Centre de ressources pour la pratique de la SCO.
Listening to EyeCan counts for unaccredited MOC credits. Listeners may claim 0.5 credits per hour under Section 2, which is individual learning as educational content review, and that can be done up to 30 credits per year.
EyeCan is written and directed by Kim Teitler and produced by John Allaire from Allaire Strategic Works.
EyeCan est écrit et réalisé par Kim Teitler et produit par John Allaire d'Allaire Strategic Works. Some episodes this season will include relevant links and show notes, so be sure to check episode descriptions to learn more. Certains épisodes de cette saison incluront des liens pertinents dans les notes d'émission, alors n'oubliez pas de consulter les descriptions des épisodes pour en savoir plus.
If any of our listeners have topic ideas to submit, please email them to communications@cos-sco.ca and we will review for consideration.